Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Samuel Luckhurst. And we're recording this episode after United lost 1-0 against Arsenal at Old Trafford on Sunday afternoon. Samuel was at the game as always, and we're going to dissect that performance throughout this episode. Samuel, first of all, how are you?
Not bad, thank you. How are you?
Good, man. Yeah, not bad at all. Obviously had some time off across the weekend, which was nice. And the sun was out until there was kind of a biblical rain on Sunday evening as the game ended. It was bizarre, wasn't it? That torrential rainfall that came down. Came from nowhere.
Well, it was forecast, so it didn't entirely come
Fair enough.
from nowhere. Yes, yeah. I even before I left the house, this is very mundane patter, but the washing that I'd left outside to dry, I checked the weather forecast. I thought I'd best actually bring that indoors before I get home. So I was glad I did.
Well, I look like a fool there. I didn't realise that it was forecast. So there you go. Anyways, enough weather chat. It's a bit crap. Let's talk about the game.
Yeah.
We expected a defeat, to be honest, Samuel. It was only 1-0 in the end, so I guess not as bad as it could have been against a title chasing Arsenal side.
No, and the strange thing was, well, it wasn't strange, but at the press conference afterwards, our colleague Neil said to Ten Hag, I'm not meaning to be negative here, but you have just lost 1-0 at home to Arsenal, because there was not a forced attempt, but the way Ten Hag was speaking, he said that the players showed a reaction. And when you use that phrase or that sentence after a game, normally the team you're talking about have just won whilst performing, and United didn't win. They lost for a second successive game. They've won, is it one game in 10 now, I think, outright. They've lost 14 Premier League games this season. They've lost 19 games overall. I think there's still a chance they could lose as many games as they've won this season come the end of it. And really yesterday, it was strange in that it was one of their better performances, in that they were compact. They restricted Arsenal to a handful of opportunities. There was a flurry in the second half when Andre Onana made a few good saves. Trossard's goal was the one outstanding chance in the first half. There was some decent individual performances. I thought Amrabat had his best game for United on his first start in the league since December the 17th. Ahmad, on his first meaningful start ever for United, was bright until he got injured. Onana, as I said, made a few good stops, but they still lost quite comfortably. Arsenal were tepid. You could tell, if you didn't know that Manchester City had played the day before, you would have easily guessed it, because there was an edginess about Arsenal's performance, which is completely understandable in the penultimate week of a season when they had the opportunity to go top again, and they took that opportunity. And they're a far better side than United. If they really, I think if United had more of a threat about them, maybe Arsenal would have responded. And some of the Arsenal players, William Saliba spoke afterwards in the mix zone, and he's not been at Arsenal for too long, but he was certainly aware of their recent record at Old Trafford and how wretched it had been, where they hadn't won there in the league with supporters present since September 2006. But as soon as the team sheets dropped yesterday, yeah, I mean, Arsenal, if Arsenal were really on it, they'd have pulverised United. In the end, as I said, I think because of the occasion, because of the history of Arsenal going to Old Trafford and not doing too well, because City had played the previous day and strolled to victory at Fulham, in a way it kind of kept the scoreline down. All those factors and some very good reflex saves from Onana. But United didn't lay a glove on Arsenal. They were toothless. Garnacho had a lot of the ball, but no real end product. I'd be reluctant to outright dig him out, because he started so many games this season. I think it's something like, it's got to be something like 35 or 36 successive starts, maybe more. And that's a hell of a workload for a 19-year-old winger at Manchester United, who's also creditably avoided injury all season. And really looking at that team, it was difficult to see how they were going to harm Arsenal. As I said, Ahmad was energetic, and he did some nice. There were some nice sequences from him, but they've got a striker who is a boy among men. Their number 10 yesterday was McTominay, and if he's not scoring, if he's not tackling, there's not a lot he really brings to the table. As brutal as that sounds, there's a reason why his most memorable impacts this season have been off the bench, because he's a terrific game changer to call upon. And you can't be positive just because they only lost 1-0 against the Premier League leaders. I think the fans had a big bearing on it as well. I think the atmosphere from the United supporters, which was a borderline carnival atmosphere, very, very supportive, very raucous, I think that probably kept the scoreline down as well. It was a surreal game in a lot of ways, just how tepid Arsenal were, and I think the main weakness from Arsenal, unsurprisingly, was their away following. Their songbook is atrocious. They do not. They travel in good numbers, but they're not good away fans as far as songs go and originality. And United were brilliantly backed again. And as I've said before, they're going to get that backing until the very end of the season, because there's going to be another All Manchester FA Cup final to play for. And the supporters want to sustain momentum for that. I think something would have to go dreadfully wrong between now and then for them to outright turn on them. And the fact that they didn't turn on them after a 4-0 thumping at Crystal Palace, it's laudable, but also there does come a point where you think, if you maintain this harmony, maybe it's going to jeopardize progress in the long term. But you'd like to think that the power brokers are far more clinical and not as impressionable as that.
When you're only losing 1-0, you've obviously got an opportunity to get back into the game, but you just never really felt like United were going to do that. As you said, they didn't really lay a glove on Arsenal at all. And I mean, to be fair, Gabriel and Saliba, they're fantastic. They're probably the best partnership in the Premier League in defence, but I mean, they just had nothing really to deal with the no-nonsense approach. United didn't have much joy at all in that sense. If we actually look into Arsenal's goal then a bit more, Samuel, what was Casemiro doing, strolling out? I've made the point a few times. I mean, you used this analogy earlier in the season. It's like playing in soccer, isn't it, at the moment, Casemiro, when you watch him? And we were quite scathing after the Crystal Palace performance at Selhurst Park, and obviously Jamie Carragher kind of torn into him. And he is playing out of position, but he's just not doing the basics right. And that was another example of it.
Well, he was playing walking football when Onana cleared the ball, and at first, after Trossard scored, Ty said, I think Onana's as culpable for that as Casemiro. And I thought, really? And I think the more he watched the goal, the more he realised that he was wrong. It was an errant kick, but
you see them.
The ball had to travel a long way up the pitch.
Yeah,
the ball had to travel a long way up the pitch still, and Casemiro just trundled out. Having his intentions were good, to try and receive the ball maybe a bit too deep. He was practically on the goal line, but then when that ball is played, your mindset's got to be, I've got to push out here in case I play someone onside. And as soon as that ball was played through, you feel, Havertz looks offside there. But then no, there's someone who's almost sat with the supporters. He's that deep. And we can't forget, I mean, I could see the halftime analysis on the TV in the press room, but there was no sound on. But they were highlighting Wan-Bissaka a fair bit. And I don't blame them, because before that, Trossard was just, when Arsenal had the ball on their right-hand side, and of course Trossard's on the left, Trossard was just loitering in absolute acres of space. And Wan-Bissaka was getting dragged in far too centrally, and he kept on looking behind him, checking where Trossard was. And then, of course, when it came to the goal, he was blindsided by him. He failed to keep check on him. And those two players who were the most culpable for that winning goal yesterday, they absolutely cannot be at United next season. I mean, all this talk about Ratcliffe asking employees to not work from home anymore. There are a few players who should be told to just train at home, stay at home, go back into quarantine, I suppose, ahead of the FA Cup final. And it's not a surprise that you see the level of performance that we saw again yesterday. And Wan-Bissaka, admittedly, is not being helped in that he's seemed to be switching from left back to right back almost every game at the moment, and you're not going to get any rhythm with that. But that said, I think Dalot did okay yesterday. He wasn't good, but he was inoffensive, and I think he can adapt a lot better than Wan-Bissaka can. And you've also got to bear in mind that with Luke Shaw having suffered another setback in his recovery, that there's a very good chance that Wan-Bissaka will start in the FA Cup final. And therefore it is probably more logical to keep him in one role in the build up to that. And the same with Dalot as well, so that they can develop some rhythm ahead of what will be the biggest game of the season.
In terms of market value for those two players at the moment, what kind of figure do we think? I mean, Wan-Bissaka has got one more year left on his contract. He's heading into that final year. Casemiro's performances have just been awful. And you're looking at him if you're a club and thinking, why do I want to touch a player in the winter of his career? His form's fallen off the edge of a cliff, hasn't it? He's declined so rapidly. And in terms of what you could actually get for those players, what do you think? Maybe 20 million for Wan-Bissaka? Would that be fair? Maybe you return to Crystal
I think that would be very good going.
Yeah, do you think that would be so less than that?
Well, the issue with Palace is that they've had a change of manager and they play with wing backs, and he is a right back who you look at, and if someone said he used to be a winger, you'd think, I'm not sure how he was even a winger. I can understand why they played him at right back, but how was he ever a winger? Because he has no concept of how to attack. And there were a few times yesterday, he wasn't the only one. There were times when United were playing these risk-aversive backwards or sideways passes, and the crowd, certainly sections of them, a minority, were becoming a little bit agitated. Even with half-time looming, United were playing too patiently. There's method in being patient if you're going to quicken the pace and you're looking for that opening. There were too many players on the pitch yesterday who they would get the ball and you had the sense that they weren't looking for the opening, or they were incapable of finding the opening. And Wan-Bissaka was probably the worst culprit for that. He's not remotely a Manchester United player in the very essence of what people would associate a Manchester United player with. And with Palace, I mean, Nathaniel Klein has been playing on the right side of a defensive trident at the moment in this 3-4-2-1. You could make a case for Wan-Bissaka playing there for Palace, but if Oliver Glasner is going to continue with a wing-back formation, which has worked extremely well for them, I mean, is it 5 wins and 1 draw in their last 6? Then, and I know at this stage of the season it can be a little bit misleading because a lot of teams can, they've got their eyes on the beach and they're already in holiday mode. But I think you've got to look at Palace's form and give them their kudos. So they're going to clearly try and sustain that momentum going into next season. But Wan-Bissaka wouldn't be their right wing back. He would have to be
Funny, we'll look
again,
at West Ham.
change of manager.
We always just try to give them United cast-offs, though, don't we? We always think, look,
I think is he an upgrade on Vladimir Koufal? If you look at the other right backs at West Ham, they are lacking. It's an area that ahead of the summer you'd say, yeah, it's completely logical to look for a right back. But is Wan-Bissaka the profile of player that West Ham would want? You could certainly see him in West Ham colours. You could see him in Palace colours, and those clubs have been interested in him in recent years. And of course, where he grew up in London, and he was a little bit homesick when he first came to Manchester. I think it would make sense on a lifestyle basis as well for him to try and get a move to a London club. I mean, you think of Brentford, the way they operate. I know they operate with a back 3, but I still believe that if Kyle Walker, seeing the way he's almost transitioned to become a centre back, even though he does still play a lot of football at right back, he's very adept at centre back. I could see Wan-Bissaka in any of those 3 teams. You've got to think of Fulham as well. Fulham were looking at Fred as a possible signing last year. So I don't think that it should be a struggle to shift Wan-Bissaka to a Premier League club. There are a lot of Premier League teams he would enhance from a defensive point of view, absolutely. And yeah, I think if they got £20 million for him, they'd do very well. But Casemiro, I mean, he's got to be off to one of the retirement homes in Saudi Arabia or the MLS. I didn't realise until Rich said yesterday that he hadn't been picked in the Brazil squad for the Copa America either. So I think his days at the elite level in football, they are well and truly numbered.
And kind of who can actually take him, though? There are so few teams who can pay those sort of wages that he will obviously have to take a pay cut. That's just a fact. But is the Saudi Arabia money drying up? I kind of get that impression that I might have had that spell last summer, the summer before that, and I don't know if that's going to happen again this time around in this transfer market when they're splashing the cash at that level. But maybe MLS is a shout. You're right. But apart from that, it's difficult. It's going to be difficult to move Casemiro on, I think.
Well, certainly because of the salary, and he's got 2 years left in his contract. But it has to be, you've got to. There comes a point where you just have to. Maybe the lifestyle aspect comes into it more than the monetary side, and he's got 2 young children. He's earned a hell of a lot of money in his career as it is, and the possibility of having that lifestyle in Saudi or America, 2 very different lifestyles, but you can certainly see him in one or the other. And it's the onus is on United to find a buyer, and then on Casemiro whether he wants that, because United have got to be completely decisive in informing him, if they haven't already, that this has to be his last season, and he has, and they have to get rid of him, and they want to get rid of him. And when a player is told that, very rarely do they end up staying. Maguire is a very, very rare exception, and United always was still quite diplomatic in what they were communicating to us about Maguire, that they would be happy if he stayed. And I completely believed that, because he would have been he is an experienced centre-back to fall back on. And he's had a very good season. But Casemiro's situation is I think it's still markedly different from Maguire's last season. Maguire last season, he had some shockers, but he didn't play too much by and large. Whereas Casemiro this season, although he had that period where he was out with a hamstring problem, when he's been fit, he's pretty much started, whether it's in midfield or whether it's at centre half. And unfortunately for him, he's been showed up a hell of a lot recently.
Yeah, and I think he'll understand that as well. I think he'll want to leave and maybe put the season behind him, because it has been just so disappointing. It's been a regression each month, really. We'll leave it there for part 1, and we'll be back in a moment for part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now, from one defensive midfielder to another, we'll start this section by talking about Sofyan Amrabat, who, as you said, Samuel, had actually a pretty decent game. If we're being brutally honest, he's looked below the level required since signing from Fiorentina on loan, but we'll give him his flowers. He was good yesterday. And I think you made the important point that Kobbie Mainoo benefited from his presence in midfield as well. We all saw that when Kobbie Mainoo came into the team, how well he worked with Casemiro, even though Casemiro had been underperforming. And I think it's so important to have that kind of defensive midfielder next to Mainoo in the midfield to get the best out of him. And that's an indicator for the summer, isn't it? It's a transfer priority for United, because they need to get that kind of player, an upgrade on Amrabat and someone that plays at number 6 to work alongside Kobbie Mainoo.
Yes, and the Mainoo Eriksson experiment has just never worked. It's a mismatch at this level. If you're a team that's informed, that retain the ball, that are proactive with the ball, you can get by with those 2 players. And United are nothing like that. And Mainoo, clearly, when Casemiro came back into the team in late January, it benefited Mainoo. It was a fillip for him that he had a specific defensive midfielder next to him. And Mainoo's form from that Newport County game into February was excellent. He was possibly one of the front runners for Player of the Month, and might have won it had Rasmus Højlund not been in such terrific form. And with Amrabat, when I think we have raised it in recent weeks as to, if you've got a defensive midfielder and there's clearly an issue of balance or lack of balance in midfield, why wouldn't you use him there? And the way he performed yesterday, even against, as I said, a tepid Arsenal side, you're still coming up against a formidable Arsenal side that were unchanged for the 4th game running. It does beg the question as to why he has been ignored for weeks on end. And
is that more of a slight on him though, Samuel, in terms of when he has played, he's not really been good, and also training performances, I guess Ten Hag does see him every day.
Possibly, and of course Ten Hag sees a lot more than we do, but going off what we know and what we see, just persisting with Eriksen as long as he did, that was illogical. I found it staggering that Eriksen started at Palace last Monday, and there was no way he could start against Arsenal. And sometimes it's just, does your face fit, or have you had a good season, or have you done well for me? And McTominay and Mainu is not necessarily a compatible midfield, or the most productive midfield that United have available, but because they have individually had a measure of form this season. I think Ten Hag that's why he went with them for the FA Cup semi-final against Coventry. And of course, when Amrabat has had opportunities or cameos, this calendar year, he's been pretty woeful. He didn't play well at all in the cup game at Forest. He's never short of endeavour or commitment, and he bustles about the pitch, but he's out of his depth at this level. But at least for him, he showed on Sunday against the league leaders at the moment that he is capable of cutting it every now and then. Maybe not over the course of a whole Premier League season, and I certainly don't expect he will be in the Premier League next season. But he does possess attributes. There's a reason why, as misleading as tournament football, international tournament football can be, there's a reason why he was somewhat in demand after Morocco's performances at the World Cup, and why he was part of that Morocco team that did so well to get all the way to the semi-finals. And I think there is a bit more mobility with his movement off the ball. He was dropping in between the centre backs yesterday, so United got the full-backs playing higher up. They were a little bit more flexible tactically with the ball. I thought United yesterday, and that they almost looked like they were having a back three at times because Amrabat was that deep. Of course, the problem you've got there is that one of your full-backs or wing-backs is Wan-Bissaka, so your attacking intent is immediately compromised, and there are a couple of other players who are either out of position in McTominay's case or out of form in Højlund's case that make it difficult to penetrate that final third when you come up against one of the best defences in the Premier League as well, or maybe the best defence in the Premier League, the way Arsenal have been performing this season. But there was a lot to like about Amrabat. I mean, he had a good start. I think Trossard, who is skillful but not particularly quick, he quite kind of gave up quite quickly in a take on. Amrabat won the ball, got a standing ovation. In the second half, he pretty much owned Bukayo Saka in a duel as well. So there were a couple of instances where he did things very well, and that was acknowledged by the supporters. So that's always going to lift a player's confidence. And our erstwhile colleague Liam Corliss messaged me this morning saying that after the way he performed yesterday, he would have Amrabat in the FA Cup final team over Casemiro. I think he's probably got to do it a couple more times this week to be certain of that. But it's not a ridiculous shout. The difficulty United have there is that nobody has got a clue, Ten Hag included, I would imagine, what their back four will be against City a week on Saturday. There's one player who's guaranteed, provided he's fit, who's going to start in defence that day, and that's Diogo Dalot. This week is going to have a big bearing as to who else makes up that back four. I suspect Wan-Bissaka will have to be in it because of Luke Shaw's setback, and it sounds like he won't play in either of these league games this week. If Martinez comes through this week, then he has to start, and then it's the other centre back place, and it's probably going to be between Varane and Maguire. But it's not ideal when you've got, I mean, Varane, Maguire, and Lindelof, three right-footed centre backs. Unless we get a fresh injury update tomorrow from Ten Hag at Carrington, United might be going into the FA Cup final with all of them not having played over the course of this week or last week.
Could see Ahmad start on the right in that game. A really bright performance as well. With some really positive runs forward. I spoke to him briefly after the 4-3 win against Liverpool in March in the mix zone. He just had a massive wide smile just across his face. He was beaming. And I thought that could be the turning point for him. I thought, right, okay, let's kick on for the rest of the year. But hasn't really happened over the last few weeks. Hasn't been given any opportunities. Finally got a meaningful start on his first start in, was it over 800 days for United or something like that? Obviously he was on loan.
It was 886.
Right, there you go. With Sunderland last season, it was a fantastic loan. But wasn't it great to see him from the first whistle, Samuel? Because we've been calling for it for weeks, and it finally happened, and it was vindicated.
And it really shouldn't have taken as long as it did for him to get a meaningful start. Yesterday was his first meaningful start for United. His 3 previous starts were all in heavily rotated teams. I think the Leicester and Wolves games in May 2021. The Leicester game was 2 days before the rearranged game with Liverpool, which was postponed because of the Super League protests. And then they played Wolves away on the final day of the season, 3 days before the Europa League final against Villarreal. And of course, his previous start was against Young Boys in the Champions League group stage, dead rubber. So yesterday was the first start of any real consequence for Ahmad. And he was bright. He should have started long before this season, and really Ten Hag's rationale for the way it doesn't wash. He said he had an injury, we had to build him up, and of course he did get injured against Arsenal in New Jersey back in July and was out for a while, but he came back into the team in late December. He came on at Forest on December 30th, I think it was, did well. So that's nearly a 5-month wait to get a start, and he's been fit for pretty much the entirety of that duration. There have been plenty of opportunities where you've looked at, like, from our perspective, doing the panels, and you have to pick your personal team, the team you'd like to see start, and we combined we'll have picked Ahmad in probably in teams on maybe a dozen occasions combined, there or thereabouts. And Anthony wasn't cutting it. He was dreadful against Crystal Palace. It would have been a travesty had he started again, having come off on the hour at Selhurst Park. He was the first to be hooked in that debacle. And this has been one of my bugbears with Ten Hag this season. It's felt like he's not wanted to seek solutions or fresh solutions or look for alternatives. Maybe he's been incapable of it, but it applies to not offering the back four proper protection. And they had specialist protection yesterday in Amrabat, and defensively, by and large, they were a lot better than they have been this season. I think a more innovative coach would have found a more innovative solution, short-term or long-term, at left-back in the absence of Shaw and Malacia. And as I said, and I half joked about it, but Anthony at left-back was a reasonable shout, and he has had a couple of stints there. He looked appalled to be put over there yesterday when there were more changes, and it's not the first time his attitude has been dire, but we've come to expect that from Anthony. It's barely newsworthy with him. So Ten Hag was asked afterwards if the right wing was Ahmad's place to lose now, which unfortunately for him, given that he came off injured yesterday, he might be out of the team on Wednesday. I hope he's not, because he had some decent momentum. He got a good ovation when he came off. He's clearly very popular. He'll always have a bit of a cult following because of that unforgettable winning goal against Liverpool. And he's certainly a player that United would be better off with in their matchday squad on FA Cup final day.
I think he's definitely been frustrated, and you really can't blame him. There was that incident, I can't remember whether it was after the Newport game or the Wigan game, when he was overlooked both times, Ahmad, when he deleted the mention of United on his Instagram, I think. I know he came out and said that was something to do with Ramadan, but I don't know, I think he was a bit frustrated, and look, that's completely understandable to be overlooked in that manner when you just want to play and you're looking at Anthony play over you. I think you must be affected. You're only human after all. If we look at the stands then, Samuel, Sergeant Ratcliffe was at the game. I think I've asked you a few times this season kind of what do you think he's been thinking, and you've laughed. No, I don't know, I don't want to speculate, but do you think a decision's been made now? Because it is the second week of May, 2 league games left, the FA Cup final around the corner. It just feels like it probably has.
If it hasn't, then Ineos's credibility will start to erode. For the FA Cup final weekend, they have to communicate their decision on the manager by Sunday at the latest. and I'm not talking about midnight on Sunday. It's got to be a normal time, a sociable time. And I'm not saying that they should be, immediately disrespectful, putting it out on the dot at 5 p.m. while Ten Hag is collecting his silver medal or his winner's medal in the royal box. But they have to communicate that decision that weekend, win or lose, and they've got all the evidence is gathered. As I said yesterday, irrespective of what happens over the course of the final 3 or 4 games, it shouldn't have a bearing on Ten Hag's future. The evidence has been gathered. They're not going to do anything over the course of these next 3 games that should change a decision. You can't make a decision based on games across, it'd be Newcastle to City with Brighton in between. That'd be about a 10-day period. You're not going to make a decision. You cannot make a decision based on 10 days. You can make a decision based on 10 months of evidence. And unfortunately for Ten Hag, the dossier, the case to change manager it's a hell of a tome. It is weighty. And there are so many unflattering numbers that make it feel like his departure is inevitable. And I think that if Ineos were to somehow say, were to actually keep him, I think their credibility as a group running a football club starts to erode, because Manchester United have lost 14 Premier League games this season. They've lost 19 games overall. It's the most games they've lost in a season since 77 to 78. It's obviously a Premier League era record number of defeats. They've got a minus goal difference still, -4. So this could be the first season since 89-90 that they end with a minus goal difference. And there have been some rose-tinted analysts saying, oh yes, but in 89-90 they won the FA Cup and then they had their period of dominance under Alex Ferguson. I think that comparison is just ludicrous. United had a good season last season and they won a trophy last season. That was the season where they ended their title drought. Comparing where Manchester United were in May 1990 compared to where they are now in May 2024, I think is ludicrous. You can look at the numbers and the numbers of games they've lost. That's absolutely reasonable. But suggesting that that there'll be a Lee Martin type saviour at Wembley and that's going to spark a 2-decade plus era of domination, I think people who are venturing that are living in fantasy land. And I take absolutely no pleasure in saying all this, because I've written very praiseworthy pieces about Ten Hag. I said last season that he's the best decision United had made since they signed Robin van Persie. Last season was very good. The trajectory was looking good. But really from the pre-season and some of the planning and the fires that they've struggled to put out throughout the course of this season, it's just spiraled, and it's been a wretched season up until now. And yes, they've got the shot at glory at the end of it, but as we've said time and again, the last Manchester United manager who won the FA Cup, who also happened to be Dutch, was getting sacked, and he was gone 2 days later.
History has a funny way of repeating itself, doesn't it? It really does. In terms of where they are on the table, they're on 54 points now behind Chelsea and Newcastle. Newcastle drew the weekend.
They'll get fewer points than the Moyes season. That's guaranteed now as well. They can't get as many points as when they're David Moyes as manager.
Well, that kind of leads us on nicely to this point, because he's looking set to maybe become the first manager since David Moyes to oversee a campaign that doesn't secure European qualification, of course. Is there actually merit in missing out in Europe at the moment? Because I quite like the Europa League. I know we've had this conversation before when you thought, oh, maybe not, but I still think
I like the knockouts.
League. Yeah, but the Conference League, I can't imagine Manchester United in the Conference League. I think that's not right to me. So I kind of starting to think it's just better for them to miss out altogether and to regroup.
Well, I think irrespective of what happens with the midweek results, where United have got Newcastle at home and Chelsea are they away to Brighton or at home to Brighton? I can't quite remember which. But irrespective of what happens in those games, United are guaranteed to go into the final day in 8th, unless there's a massive monumental goal swing. They're on -4 goal difference. Chelsea have got 12. Newcastle have got 22. So I suppose if United do beat Newcastle, 26-0, then at least they will move up the table. But I don't think any bookmaker on earth would be giving any odds on that. So that's another. That's the reality of that is just galling. It would have been unthinkable at the start of the season. United going into the final day in 8th, having finished 3rd last season. They are closer to Luton Town points wise than they are to Arsenal in the table. And again, I don't think many people would have predicted that at the start of the season. It's just been that the league campaign has been wretched. You just look at the column and those numbers are stark: 16 wins, 14 defeats.
Do you not think there's a bit of a numbness now to it? As in, we're on the podcast. We've talked about it. Yeah. We're getting into, but there is a bit of a numbness now to all these defeats. We're just used to it at this point, and we're coming into the end of the season. Well, it is what it is, kind of thing.
I think the supporters are, because they've decided, well, rather than just turn on them, let's just enjoy ourselves. And they were raucous yesterday, and I think that they do like to pride themselves on being genuinely supportive by definition, and that's very creditable and laudable. When other big clubs, their supporters on the continent, they probably wouldn't act that way. So it's you can't knock it really. But what I always feel is that if Manchester United see themselves as being bracketed among the great clubs of football, like Real Madrid and Bayern Munich and Barcelona, would those clubs tolerate what's going on? They absolutely wouldn't. So you've got to act like them as well.
And there was obviously food for thought for Ratcliffe as the rain came down and cascaded over the seats and onto the pitch. I mean, there was standing water, wasn't there, I think, on the pitch after the game, shortly after, probably around 5 minutes after. It was a deluge. But I mean, Old Trafford, the future of Old Trafford's high on the agenda, and he's sitting there looking at that. Keir Starmer was at the game as well, wasn't he, Samuel? Obviously, a bit of political clout for maybe the task force, but he's looking at that thinking, we need to address this. It's almost a metaphor for the failing reign of the Glazers over the last 15 years, isn't it, really, Old Trafford?
Yeah, there was a waterfall that came down from the Stretford End roof before the derby in April 2019, and yesterday there was a waterfall coming down from the East Stand roof. There were scenes bordering on the flooding in the Sir Bobby Charlton stand. That roof has been leaking for at least 7 years that I've been covering United games. It's scandalous the state the stadium is in, and that's a consequence of the Glazer family's ownership. And I don't blame Ratcliffe whatsoever for wanting to build a new one, and I hope they come to a decision sooner rather than later. It's in everyone's interest that United get down to work as soon as possible to get a new stadium going. But in the meantime, they're going to be in Old Trafford for a fair old while, so there need to be substantial repairs to plug the gaps. And it does right itself at times, because of course it's an easy metaphor for the way they've been defending as well this season. And you could have written that 5 years ago, but that's United. They don't seem to learn.
What we could do is we could just ask the government to turn off the water, because if you believe what Matt Letizia says, the government actually controlled the weather, Samuel. So we could just ask them to stop the clouds for the next few years while that rebuild gets done, or maybe get refurbished. We'll leave it there for part one. We'll leave it there for part two. We'll be back in a moment for part three. We're recording this on Monday afternoon, Samuel. United are back in action on Wednesday evening against Newcastle, last week of the season. Newcastle have almost been a bit of a funny team the last few weeks. Hit some form, but then, as I say, drew against Brighton at the weekend. It was a very disappointing performance, I thought. So they're kind of coming into this game. It's their cup final, so it's going to be tough for United. But I think if you're a Newcastle fan, and from a Newcastle perspective, you have fear going into that game just because of the last 50 years. I think they're looking for the second win at Old Trafford in the league in 52 years, I think. So the record at Old Trafford isn't good. But on the flip side, they have won the last 3 meetings since United won in the Carabao Cup final.
Yeah, I said before yesterday, just looking at the opponents, the 4 opponents United had in their final 4 games, if you look at Ten Hag's record against those teams before yesterday, against Arsenal, it was 1 win and 2 defeats. Against Newcastle, it was a draw, a win, and 3 defeats. Against City, I think it's been they won the home game last season, lost 2 last season, lost 2 this season. And against Brighton, they've lost 3 league games, and they drew the cup semi-final, which they won on a penalty shootout. And I take it back to, I think of my friend who said that we won't get another point again this season after the Burnley game, and I think he was possibly right. United, really, with this Newcastle game, it's the final home game of the season, so they owe the supporters a performance, and there is still an outside chance that they'll get European qualification through their Premier League table finish. I think the one I'm looking forward to more this week, and obviously we'll talk about it more in depth on Friday, is the Brighton game, because you always get these games on the final day where there's just this surreal scoreline where it gives you see it and you think, were all the players drunk out there, or playing blindfolded, or God knows what, or were the goals 10 times bigger? I think of Middlesbrough beating City 8-1, or Stoke hammering Liverpool 6-1 2015, and that time when Newcastle hammered Tottenham 5-1 when they'd been relegated, and Tottenham had just missed out on the title. So I think that game, given that I think that both teams may have nothing to play for on Sunday, that could be carnage. It might be quite high up on the match of the day pecking order, even though there might not be much riding on it. But with Newcastle, they've done excellently under Eddie Howe against United. They're, even with that shadow side they fielded in the League Cup game back in November, they did a number on them. They've recruited really well. There's a reason why, of course, United want Dan Ashworth to come in as sporting director. It seems like Livramento and Hall are getting a bit more prominence of late. They've got a terrific front three when they're all playing and all firing in Isaac, Gordon and Barnes. Guimaraes has been one of the best signings in the Premier League in the last 2 years or so. And it's a game that you can see United not winning. For United's sake, you have to hope for them that Fernandes is back, because I know they've not been good this season, but they are a hell of a lot worse when he's not in the starting lineup.
In terms of changes, would you make any changes to the team? I know Ahmad came off, obviously, but it'd be good to see him have a successful start, wouldn't it, if he's fit enough?
It certainly would. Hopefully he's okay. Certainly Fernandes, if he's fit, he has to come in. But we expected Fernandes to play yesterday, and he ended up being closer to us, sat in the director's box next to the press box. But we never know what we're going to get from Ten Hag's injury bulletins. On Friday, of course, it was, Mason Mount is injured again. I mean, Brian Clough's immortal quote to Eddie Gray when he took over at Leeds, which was that if you were a racehorse, you'd have been shot by now, because he was so injury prone. That really does apply to quite a few players in this United squad. You look at Mason Mount and Luke Shaw, Anthony Marshall, Rafael Varane, Tyrone Marshall. I think that's half a team that I've just reeled off there, and maybe a few others.
Just killed off a few players there. I'm not sure the families will be happy with that.
Hopefully not literally. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, with Touchwood, we do joke. Thanks for your time, Samuel. We'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
And thanks, listeners, as usual. Have a great week. We'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.